Thank you, Paul. Hello to everyone from London. It's fantastic to be part of this phenomenal series. I've managed to dial into a few of the panels earlier today, and they were all fascinating. So thank you again for dialing into this China Energy panel. What we're trying to do over the next 55 minutes is somewhat ambitious, as we want to span oil and gas, coal, renewables, climate policy, and really things have changed quite remarkably in the past sort of 5 months. I think at the beginning of 2020, when we were all looking at China's energy policies, it was all 13th five-year plan and which targets would be met and which wouldn't, and how sort of everybody was thinking about the 14th five-year plan. Phase one US-China deal was looking up. The economy was starting to pick up slightly, or at least kind of a GDP goal of up to 6% growth was looking manageable. And then, of course, COVID-19 hit and things have changed quite considerably. So what we're going to do is talk about which things have changed and which things haven't. And I have a fantastic panel of experts here with me to do that, again, over the next slightly under an hour. We have Erica Downs, who is a senior research scholar at Columbia's Center on Global Energy Policy. We've got Joanna Lewis, who is associate professor of energy and environment and director of the Science, Technology and International Affairs program at Georgetown University, and Sam Giel, who is executive director at China Dialogue. Now, what I'll ask the speakers to do is kick off with a few short introductory remarks before we turn to a general discussion and take Q&A from the audience. And so without further ado, let me turn it over to Erica.
Thank you, Mahal. It's a pleasure to be here today. In my remarks, I'm going to talk about two issues that I've been following in China's oil and gas industry, domestic production and the energy component of the US-China trade deal. And so what I'm going to do is quickly talk about what were some of my expectations going into 2020, how has COVID-19 changed things, and then I'm just going to flag a few issues to watch going forward. Slide, please. So going into 2020, my expectations for domestic oil and natural gas production targets were that they looked quite ambitious. On the oil side, this is because China has a lot of mature high-cost fields. And on the gas side, it's because the 2020 shale gas target continues to look overly optimistic. That being said, I still expected China's national oil companies to try really hard to meet these targets. And this goes back to the summer of 2018 when Xi Jinping instructed the companies to step up their efforts to increase domestic output to enhance national energy security. And as a result of that, we saw the companies substantially increase their CapEx budgets and roll out their first ever 7-year plans for oil and natural gas development. And last year, we saw a reversal of the 3-year decline in China's oil production. Turning to the US-China trade deal and the energy targets in the agreement signed in January, right from the start, I thought those targets looked challenging to meet, in large part because of the magnitude of growth they envisioned off a pretty low 2017 base. That being said, the fact that the agreement was signed signaled to me that there was an opportunity for China to substantially increase its purchases of US crude and LNG, and for energy to become a bright spot in the bilateral relationship. Slide, please. COVID-19, however, has changed things and has made me think that these targets are going to be even more difficult to be met. In terms of domestic oil and gas production, it's going to be hard to increase production, especially of oil, in a low oil price environment, especially when international crude is trading below the break-even costs for China's national oil companies. And turning to the trade deal, the targets look even more difficult to meet in a low price environment because the targets in the agreement are in US dollars. So basically, the lower the price of oil, the lower the price of LNG, the more of these commodities that China must purchase to meet the targets. That being said, it is worth pointing out that the trade agreement does contain language that would allow for both countries to walk away from the agreement with a face-saving explanation for why targets have not been met, but an open question is whether or not that language will be used. Slide, please. And just finally, by way of conclusion, I wanted to highlight 3 issues to watch going forward. The first one is how China's national oil companies balance economic and security imperatives. The last time we had a prolonged period of crude oil prices following the collapse in the crude price in mid-2014, the companies erred on the side, or they tilted more in favor of prioritizing economics, and they voluntarily shut in some of their fields for the first time. What's different in this environment is there is this added political pressure to enhance production, but the companies have announced CapEx, and I would not be surprised if some production cuts, especially on oil, come. Second issue to watch is how the US-China relationship is going to impact China's oil and gas industry. And this goes beyond trade agreement targets to also how China's thinking about energy supply security. And the final issue is just whether China's oil and natural gas industry reforms this year and going into the 14th five-year plan period. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erica. I think there's certainly a lot that we can pick up on later in the discussion. Maybe just one quick follow-up question before we turn to Joanna. I mean, you noted that China is unlikely to meet the oil and gas purchase targets, oil and LNG, from the US this year. Do you think it will become a sticking point in the bilateral relationship? Or, you know, if we put it differently, is there appetite in the US and Washington to take China to task on this year?
My view is that right now the Trump administration is focused on blaming China for the outbreak of COVID-19, and I expect this will remain a focus up until the presidential election in November. I also think that with respect to the targets in the trade agreement, that President Trump may care more about the agricultural targets being met. So if there is a fair amount of progress on that front, that may take some pressure off the energy targets. However, if the Trump administration does want to call China out for not living up to its end of the agreement, then certainly any progress that isn't made on the energy front, I expect would be fair game.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, we'll touch a bit more on the US-China dynamics later on in our conversation. For now, I want to go back a little bit to the domestic outlook and some of the targets. I guess let's move to the greener side of the spectrum. And with that, I'll turn it over to Joanna, please.
Great, thank you. So I was going to speak briefly about the renewable energy sector and how the outlook for this year has really evolved a bit in light of the outbreak. Next slide, please. So globally and in China, I mean, it's just to sort of set the stage, we actually are seeing more renewable than non-renewable power capacity being constructed, right? So if you look at what new power plants are being built around the world, you've seen a really dramatic increase in the scale up of particularly solar and wind in the last few years. And so even though China still, of course, has put in place the most coal power capacity in the last decade, they've, of course, also played an extremely important role globally in scaling up renewables. Next slide. And this, of course, is really because the dramatic technology improvements we've been seeing in the renewable space, as well as dramatically increasing manufacturing scale. And then this has led to rapid deployment around the world. And all of this has driven very rapid cost declines. This is data showing over the last decade or so how dramatically we've seen the learning curves fall for a lot of the key clean energy technologies here, showing you solar PV module prices, onshore wind prices, and lithium-ion batteries, which of course are crucial in energy storage, both for the power sector as well as vehicles. And you see extremely dramatic declines. Next slide. So that's the good news. And, you know, this year was actually already poised to be an extremely challenging one for the clean energy sector in China, because 2020 was really meant to be the transition year from a market that up until now has really relied very heavily on government subsidies, feed-in tariffs for the most part for wind and solar technology. over much of the last decade. And we now are seeing the Chinese government really shift to these subsidy-free renewables projects. These are the ones that are being targeted for priority for construction. There was an alert system that has recently been put in place to actually block construction in provinces where we've seen all sorts of issues related to curtailment or construction delays. And so that already was starting to slow growth. And then the end of the subsidies, of course, has resulted in even more slower growth than we had been seeing in the last few years. Essentially, if projects had already been approved and they can get their construction in by the end of next year, they still are eligible for the original subsidies they were approved for. But because many of them were not scheduled to be done at that point when this announcement came out, we've seen a rush to try to complete construction on these projects. And then, of course, with a lot of construction being halted altogether in the early part of this year due to the outbreak, it may be more challenging for these projects to meet that deadline. Next slide. If you look at if you compare the growth that we've seen across sort of the different traditional versus the new energy sectors in the first quarter of this year compared to the first quarter of last year, year on year, you actually see much stronger growth in the wind and solar and the newer energy technologies than you see in the more traditional sectors of thermal, hydro, and nuclear. So this is somewhat of a positive spot. It looks like the cleaner energy technologies are competing better even in the current economic environment. Next slide. And you've seen even further cost reductions. So the data I showed earlier, which went through 2018, 2019, you actually see even if you look up through the first half of this year, dramatically decreased cost in solar. And so now, for example, in China, solar is actually on a levelized cost basis. You see the cheapest benchmark project prices for solar compared to coal or wind. Last slide. So just to end, I think looking forward in terms of the outlook for 2020, of course, the 14th five-year plan is going to be crucial for the sector in terms of what kind of targets we see, what kind of signals we see. There's a specific five-year plan for renewable energy that the National Energy Administration is currently working on. Of course, all the other energy and climate targets will have implications for the scale up of low carbon technologies. Looking at the new ministerial role, which I can talk about later, and how the shift towards the new Ministry of Ecology and Environment may affect these targets, and the timing of the targets, of course, is important for climate policy as well. There's been a new draft energy law released just last month, which includes more details on essentially a renewable portfolio standard type policy, which is meant to help address the curtailment issue. A lot of attention on what, additional stimulus announcements coming out of China, whether we're going to see more green or more brown, how the government will sort of decide to support different industries and what that means for renewables. And then finally, I think it'll be important to look at whether we see a loosening of construction deadlines for subsidy eligibility, whether the delayed rollout of the emissions trading system, which we're seeing, which this was going to be a crucial year for launching power sector emissions control for China's cap and trade for carbon. It's going to be unclear sort of how the delay might affect renewables. And then finally, maybe we can speak later about the Belt and Road Initiative and implications for how China's building not just fossil, but also non-fossil energy projects around the world, and how these sort of changes due to the outbreak might change energy infrastructure investments abroad. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. I mean, again, a lot to process and think through, a very comprehensive presentation. If to pick up on one point, just a quick follow-up. I mean, you noted that the costs of renewables are dropping and that they are competitive. I mean, there's sort of grid parity on some of them. So what do you think are the kind of main policy and technology factors that we need to look out for, at least this year, when we think about renewable development?
Yeah, I think, certainly the high level signals coming out of the 14th five-year plan are going to be extremely important, as well as for the complementary targets like carbon intensity and energy intensity, because ultimately, in order to bring a higher share of renewables into China's total energy mix, we need to bring down total consumption and diversify away from coal and other fossil energy. I think, the other thing that's going to be interesting to watch is, even though renewables are competitive without subsidies now, on a levelized cost of energy basis, there's still many, many challenges to constructing renewables projects in China. And So I think there's a lot of changes that still need to be made there, and that's going to be important to watch. A lot of this is tied to broader power sector reform questions, as well as questions around the energy law. And, you know, I think that the fact that renewable projects are looking competitive in China is positive, but we're still seeing much slower growth than we had been seeing in the last few years. This is going to be a difficult time for these industries. These are industries that are very susceptible to market instabilities, because you need essentially guaranteed market share going forward to keep a lot of these factories open, to signal investment in innovation and everything that's needed. So those are some of the things that I think are important factors to keep an eye on.
Fantastic. And we'll come back to a lot of those issues. But for now, the last, but certainly not least speaker, let me turn to Sam Gill. I mean, you know, we've heard about the falling cost of renewables, but also of fossil fuels, and this question of a green or brown stimulus. Sam, talk us through your thoughts, please.
Thanks. So I thought I'd say something about what we'd expected in 2020 and 2021 around environmental negotiations and climate, as well as what signals there are for a stimulus and critically the future of coal in China. We can move to the next slide. There's been some signals indicating the need for, or the desire for, revived approaches to environmental governance in China. At the end of April, President Xi made an inspection tour of Shanxi province, where he explained in reference to a local outcry over illegal construction and environmental destruction in 2014, that from now on, a cadre in Shanxi province must first understand this lesson. Don't repeat the same mistakes, be a guardian of the ecology of Qinling. And this has been interpreted as a signal of an ecological focus in China's post-virus reconstruction. And that focus would fit with Xi Jinping's ecological civilization vision, which has become a very prominent phrase in leadership propaganda. But I think partly owing to the delays in the legislative timetable, we have, you know, the twin sessions, which normally occur in March, being pushed to May, various other sort of impacts of COVID-19. There's little clarity at the moment on the size and the composition of any kind of centrally managed stimulus package. What is apparent is a little bit of language about something called the 6 protections on employment, basic livelihood, market players, food and energy security, supply chain stability, and so-called grassroots institutions. And there's also clearly signals that something called neo-infrastructure or new infrastructure, it will form the part of any such spending. And this is a catch-all term that's being used to cover 5G, ultra-high voltage grid transmission, intercity rail, EV charging stations, big data centers, AI. For those projects to be green, they'll of course need to be energy efficient, they'll need to run on renewable power, but it's at least a signal that the government is considering strategic support to innovation rather than simply stimulating polluters. But talking of stimulating polluters, if we look at the next slide, there are concerns over whether coal will get a boost. In February, the National Energy Administration lowered the risk ratings for coal power overcapacity in many parts of the country for the 3rd year running, which effectively opens the door for more regions to build coal power from 2021 to 2023. In theory, those risk ratings are used by the central government to cool the expansion of coal-fired power, since the approval powers have been devolved to the local level. And you might expect them to attempt to cool that too, since the risks are very high. Coal companies are losing money, utilization rates are low. You know, the report from the China Electricity Council in 2018-19 found that almost 50% of Chinese thermal power generators lost money over the year. But the low risk rating, which you know, we can get into, but I think reflects probably political concerns about stability, unemployment, future supply crunch, gave a green light to new coal. And Global Energy Monitor reports that just in the first 18 days of March, China approved the construction of 7.96 gigawatts of coal power, more than the 6.31 gigawatts approved over the whole of 2019. In March, Carbon Tracker found that China has 99.7 gigawatts of coal power capacity under construction, another 106.2 gigawatts more in the planning pipeline. That's about 40% of global capacity under construction or in planning. And that's, you know, at the same time as we're finding that 70% of the country's operating coal plants cost more to run than the cost of building new onshore wind or utility scale solar PV. Yet as Dr. Lewis has shown, renewables haven't been given the same level of policy boost. The indications, therefore, for the 14th five-year plan, which is now in the research phase, headline figures due to be announced in March 2021, and the sectoral plans fleshed out thereafter, are critical, and they do suggest, at least what we've heard, that there may be a step away from climate ambition. While there are indications that the 14th five-year plan could include a carbon emissions cap for the first time, there's also been proposals for a yet looser cap on coal-fired capacity, specifically to expand it about 200 gigawatts to 1,300 gigawatts in total. So this leaves really big questions around the environment and around the progress of environmental negotiations, which were, very expected this year. 2020 was expected to be the so-called super year for the environment, characterized by synergies across and between the environmental negotiations and the prospect of renewed international cooperation to unlock greater environmental ambition. It barely needs saying that the year hasn't turned out as planned, and there's been myriad grave impacts of COVID-19 on these processes. These include the delays and postponements and even cancellations of the schedule for international environmental negotiations, including the UNFCCC COP26, the UN climate talks under the Paris Agreement that were scheduled initially to take place in Glasgow in November, which had now been postponed to a date to be determined in 2021. The Convention on Biological Diversity talks in Kunming, which were scheduled for the autumn in China, have also been moved to as yet unscheduled time in 2021. And then, of course, the knock-on effects on domestic policymaking, including the submission of China's so-called NDC, its pledge to the Paris Agreement. This is a critical year for a renewed NDC. It's 5 years since the Paris Agreement, at the moment of a so-called global stocktake, where we've tried to ratchet up global ambition. China has indicated that it won't submit that until after the US elections in November. And of course, if we think about the US elections, we can also then think about the growing international tensions, particularly the further deterioration of the US-China relationship, which was, of course, once a linchpin of climate cooperation. And not to mention the profound negative impacts on the global economy, the fears of a looming recession, and the ways in which that can, feed concerns around the need for greater environmental deregulation or putting climate ambition on the back burner. So this is all to say that the year hasn't turned out as planned, but there are opportunities, particularly around the future of EU-China relations. I do think that this might be particularly important, not only because US-China's relations are in such a parlous state, but also because Europe has planned a major EU-China summit in Leipzig under the German EU presidency in the second half of 2020, with climate change high on the agenda. For many climate negotiations, this is looking to be an important moment, and it hasn't yet been delayed or postponed. The hope is that maybe this could actually be the point at which international cooperation around sustainability is reinvigorated, particularly with the post-COVID-19 recovery as an opportunity to put resilience, sustainability, nature, climate, and health back on the agenda with EU-China climate cooperation as a central pillar. So I'll leave you with that hopeful note of maybe whether we could have a super year for the resilient recovery in 2021. Thanks.
Thank you, Sam, for that note of optimism. Let me, my follow-up question, though, tone down that optimism maybe a little bit and just ask you, I mean, they're a mixed bag here in terms of the policy signals that we're getting. Do you think that the coal lobby in China has actually emerged stronger from COVID-19?
I think the coal lobby was already somewhat emboldened by a worsening geopolitical and economic situation pre-COVID-19, particularly the US-China trade war and fears of an economic downturn. I think COVID-19 injects an added uncertainty, and that can work both ways. On the one hand, it feeds into an energy security narrative, a very strong one, that is something that the coal lobby and sort of vested interests associated with the coal industry in China will be happy to exploit, given that China has ample domestic resources of coal and doesn't leave China exposed to the geopolitical entanglements and volatile pricing associated with other fossil fuel imports. But on the other, there's an opportunity that China can grasp from accelerating the low carbon transition. My stance on China's climate ambition has always been that international pressure plays a very limited role. It's mostly about domestic imperatives that China sees in around climate transition, particularly the opportunity for technology leadership in exporting low carbon technologies to the rest of the world, in enhancing energy security through investment in renewables and exploiting the strong economic benefits of the learning curve effects and so on that Joanna Lewis has so well pointed out, as well as, of course, mitigating urban air pollution, restructuring the economy, and expanding party legitimacy by dealing with an issue of popular concern. So there is an opportunity that China can grasp here, and I do think it's genuinely a moment at which things are up for grabs.
Thanks, Sam. I mean, let's talk a little bit more about the fallout from COVID-19 here. And if I can turn to you, Joanne, on this one. I mean, you highlighted a very interesting, I think, phenomenon that we've seen globally is that during COVID-19, as power demand fell, the coal and gas took a bigger share of the loss, whereas renewables held up quite well. But as we're seeing now, the collapse in fossil fuel prices globally, do you think that adds an additional sort of weight or that works against renewables this year? Or is there sort of a way that that this turns around and, as sort of Sam pointed to, a more hopeful outcome, despite that kind of the economic competitiveness here of the fuels?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's going to be major pressures in China to stimulate the economy and to keep people employed. And China's coal industry is still a huge employer. In addition, you know, when demand is down, it is harder for renewables to compete because even if they're technically cheaper, they still have to compete against a coal industry being supported by, you know, a variety of government programs, some of which have already been announced, some of which are yet to be rolled out, which are reducing output, therefore pushing up prices and driving, you know, and essentially guaranteeing output contracts at the expense of whatever contracts the renewable sectors might have. And, you know, as Sam mentioned, even before the outbreak, we were already seeing backsliding in China in commitments to slow growth in coal. So this was happening well through 2019, even before this year. And that was, you know, unfortunately a reversal of the trends we had seen really since 2013, where coal demand had been down quite dramatically from where it had actually been projected to be. So, you know, ultimately the power sector in China is still very tightly controlled by the government, and economic signals are less important in a non-market context.
And so just to follow up on that, is there a role here for sort of local governments versus the central government? I mean, can we see different stories playing out in some of the regions?
Yes, well, I mean, I think you certainly see the central government in many ways kind of handing renewable subsidies back to the local governments, saying, you know, we're going to move away from these centrally allocated policies, which came out of revenue from the National Renewable Energy Law, and they're leaving it open for the provinces to support these industries. And you're seeing several do that, particularly the ones that have a vested interest in, you know, they might have companies who are from those provinces, they want to keep the factories open. But I think it's really important to consider the broader political economy of renewable energy here, because, you know, not all of the challenges facing the sector are just driven by sort of technical or economic considerations. You know, as China has really been able to make extensive progress in a lot of the technical issues that we see facing this industry, ability to forecast, right, in relatively intermittent technologies, grid integration, curtailment. I think we've seen a lot of progress there, and it's really the broader political and institutional issues that are much harder to address. So, you know, we see protectionism continuing in these industries, and I think we think about protectionism as an international trade issue, but actually this is a sort of cross-provincial issue as well. This is a local issue where you have provinces that happen to be rich in renewable resources. They want to export that power to other provinces, but those provinces don't want to take that power because they're not necessarily benefiting from the manufacturing of those technologies, from the tax incentives surrounding the place where that power is being generated if it's not local. Also we still see, of course, China flush with protections for legacy sectors, not just the coal industry, but the big state-owned grid companies. And the ability, I think, of renewables to compete in the long term in China is going to require much broader reforms to the power sector in particular, but just in general into the way the country prices technologies, prices fuels, writes contracts, and whether we see more, stronger market signals essentially introduced in the power sector.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at this whole question of the incumbents, and another area where we've seen some progress, and I'll come to you on this one, Erica, has been in terms of liberalization, has been oil and gas, where we've had the new independent refineries and kind of new entrants into the LNG field. But Erica, do you think that now with COVID-19 and some of the financial stress, do you think we're going to see the incumbents make a comeback, or how is this going to impact the kind of state of play between the new entrants and the state-owned enterprises?
I think right now is a time when we're actually seeing, or we might be seeing, economic factors running counter to the direction of policy. There has been, for a number of years, interest in the Chinese government in getting more non-state-owned players, more private companies involved in the oil and gas industry, in the upstream, in the midstream, in the downstream. At the end of last year, for example, we did see the Central Committee and the State Council, issue guiding opinions on how to support the growth of private enterprise in China. They did signal out the oil and gas industry and sort of talk about what they envisioned in terms of seeing more space for private companies, throughout the different segments of the industry. So I think certainly at a high level, there is an appetite to see private players occupy a bit more space. That being said, there is the question sort of at the firm level, to what extent in a low oil price environment do companies have an appetite to spend more money on exploration and production. Certainly on the downstream, on the refining side of things, anytime crude is trading below $40 per barrel, which is the floor the Chinese government puts under oil prices, this is good news for China's independent refineries to try to ramp up their runs and their profits.
So do you think, staying with you still for a second, Erica, this world of sort of low oil prices and cheap LNG, is that sort of a mini stimulus to the Chinese economy? How does that support a demand recovery?
My view is that it's certainly positive for economic recovery, with two caveats. One is the $40 oil price floor that I mentioned, that as long as international crude is trading below 40, Chinese motorists aren't going to enjoy diesel and gasoline prices as low as people in other countries are. So the benefits there are going to be limited. And then the second factor I'd flag is that the extent to which oil prices can stimulate economic activities depends on which activities sort of are prohibited or allowed in China or in its trading partners in relation to COVID-19, that low oil prices can't stimulate activities that people aren't allowed to do, or that they're simply reluctant to do because of concerns about the virus.
So really, I mean, if we turn a little bit to kind of the post-COVID, to what comes next and to the recovery, again, we've heard that the energy priorities are still being drafted, the 14th five-year plan, and really a mixed bag of sort of lobbying and influential voices. And I think this question now of green versus brown stimulus will be key, not just for China, but obviously for China and its position internationally. Historically, what we've seen that the government's response has been infrastructure stimulus, mainly through state-owned actors and incumbents, and really they've been supportive for smokestack industries. But we've talked a little bit about the financial constraints and some of the costs, and even though you've all highlighted that costs are not the be-all and end-all of the decision-making process, is this still a viable question, sort of a viable issue this time around? And Sam, this one is directed for you. I mean, for several years, as you mentioned, coal producers have been out of the money. And utilization rates have been low. So this 100 plus gigawatts of coal-fired capacity that's in the pipeline, is there a risk of it becoming stranded assets?
I mean, half of the global coal fleet operating is operating at a loss. 60% cost more to run than building new renewables. So the idea that coal is cheap and affordable is kind of swiftly being sort of destroyed around the world, and stranded assets are basically inevitable. If governments and investors build new coal capacity while generating less power, with the utilization rate falling, there is an asset bubble that's being created. There are two tipping points that push coal below renewables: when it becomes cheaper to invest in new renewables than operate existing coal, and when the levelized cost of renewables drops lower than the operating cost for coal. And those economics are flipping. The inflection point has reached Europe. In other areas, it's sort of happening in different rates, but it's expected worldwide by the 2030s. The problem is in China, of course, is that the economics of that only manifest when the true price is visible. And this then depends on the ways in which the market deregulates and guaranteed hours for plants come down and so on. Hence the sort of discussion around that kind of power sector reform. But as the real economics become more visible, there will be change. And at the moment, already onshore wind and solar is the cheapest type of new power plant to build, where in 2014 it was coal. And this is thanks to, as Joanna pointed out, this incredible sort of learning rate for PV modules, for lithium-ion batteries, and so on. So in short, yes, I mean, there will be stranded assets in coal, and to a large extent, we're already seeing that, given that we have something like a less than 50% utilization rate of coal capacity across China.
And when we extend that, and maybe again a follow-up question for you, and then for Joanna to chime in on the Belt and Road. Again, China has been financing a lot of the coal investments throughout the BRI, but also some of the renewables. I mean, does the need to stimulate growth mean a renewed emphasis on, again, the coal production internationally? And also, I guess a question that's come in here is, does it revive Made in China 2025 as it relates to these industries?
So, I mean, lending was already falling before COVID-19 to BRI projects. So there's something of an opportunity that China can grasp at this moment to either continue to have an impact, which would be felt proportionally more in a context where the global economy is sort of going to a downturn because they do have the money to lend if they want to. Or indeed to reorientate, particularly away from, say, fossil fuel investments, which did form a large chunk of the investment from the policy banks and so on overseas and the state-owned enterprises. We just saw the shelving of the Hamraouen coal-fired power proposed coal-fired power project in Egypt, a 6.6 gigawatt project, an enormous project, that was shelved in Egypt thanks to overcapacity concerns and a growing preference there for renewable energy. And that was led by a consortium of China's Shanghai Electric and Dongfang Electric with an Egyptian company, Hassan Alam Construction. There's also been the postponement of projects in Pakistan and in Bangladesh, but still, a number of large Chinese invested coal projects. And then this question over whether these countries will be financially burdened by power capacity payments and so on if these plants are going to stand idle. So again, we're at a bit of an inflection point for China's decisions around how it invests along the BRI. There's a lot of talk, a lot of rhetoric around the idea of a green BRI, of a shared community of destiny that incorporates ecological civilization and so on. But that portfolio will have to change, and this again is an opportunity that China could grasp to reorient some of those investments in the context of a sort of changing world.
Joanna, did you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I would just add that, I agree that we are really in this inflection point. I think there's certainly, before the outbreak was a lot of needed focus on the role China and the Belt and Road Initiative have been playing in shaping energy infrastructure decisions overseas, and particularly in developing and emerging economies. But as you mentioned, China is also by far the largest exporter of, for example, solar photovoltaic technology in these countries. So, one of the things that we've been looking at is under the BRI model, for the most part, recipient countries don't benefit from technology transfer or knowledge transfer because Chinese firms are not only manufacturing the technology and either exporting it or manufacturing it locally, but hanging on to the sort of important IP. They also tend to bring in their own workers or develop and maintain projects. And I think, what could be interesting as a result of COVID-19 is a shift in the way that, the outbreak is certainly making it more difficult to rely on overseas expertise. More localization would make it easier to continue to move these projects forward under increased, or ongoing travel and trade restrictions. So I think that's another just important aspect of the BRI model to keep an eye on.
And I think, Erica, you've looked a little bit at the BRI as well from kind of the pull from the investor countries, sort of from the investees, I guess. Would you like to chime in on that or on anything else here on the BRI?
Yes, thank you for bringing that up, because that was one point I wanted to make in terms of looking at the reorientation of the BRI in a greener direction. I just wanted to point out that it's important not only to look at what's going on in China and the factors that had been pushing China to promote the development of coal-fired power plants overseas, but also to look at the pull country, the pull from host countries. It does take two to tango, and it can be hard to sell something to someone who doesn't want to buy it. And certainly in the case of Pakistan, which I've looked at in quite a bit of detail, there was a really, really strong desire to have foreign companies come in and help them develop their domestic coal reserves and develop a coal-fired power generation fleet. And that desire was already really quite strong before Xi Jinping even unveiled the BRI. So there are factors on sort of both sides of the equation, both China and the host country, that I think need to be taken into consideration. And certainly what Joanna just said about travel restrictions and does this lead to more sort of development by host country actors by host countries, is that one thing that also could, push us more in a green direction, as well as, whatever rethink, might be going on in Beijing.
Thank you, Erica. We've got a few questions coming in already about sort of China's role and its sort of more ambitious climate commitments globally. And Sam, you touched on that earlier. Maybe if you could expand a little bit on, again, there are sort of hesitations about whether or not China would ramp up its ambitions for the NDCs and for sort of the COP26, that will now be next year. How do you, again, what are we seeing in terms of all these mixed signals? Where does China stand now in terms of its position and its global leadership? And then Joanna, if you wanted to chime in on kind of the US, China, and that tango between the two that used to be very close collaborators towards Paris, and where things stand now. But let's start with Sam, please.
So yeah, as Joanna's mentioned and I've mentioned as well, things weren't looking great in 2019 in terms of the signals for China's kind of increased climate ambition. There had been an uptick in production and consumption of coal, for example, even if the overall sort of share of coal in the energy mix was falling. And there was definitely a sense that already the kind of geopolitical tensions and the fears of an economic downturn were meaning that probably expectations weren't that high. But there were a few things that sort of worked against this, and I suppose we were hoping that might be, or from an environmental perspective, people were hoping might help to kind of consolidate some kind of renewed ambition, and that was the sort of hope of the so-called super year of the environment, the one that, as I say, has been derailed by postponements, by the sort of escalating saber rattling between the US and China, by fears of a looming recession. But I do think there's a real opportunity. I think recovery plans, particularly sort of stimulus packages, and strategic funding, targeted policy reform, so on, do actually present an opportunity for kind of dynamic coordination and international cooperation around how we might actually transition towards healthier, low carbon economic development models and prioritize environmental innovation. And I do think that there is something that could unfold next year, with, say, Leipzig as the start, around sort of coordination in 2021. The UK will be the chair of the G7 that year, and also, of course, then we'll be hosting COP26. There is an opportunity there for coordination, potentially in a world with a new US president who wants to be seen to rejoin, a sort of multilateral liberal international order. Italy, the other co-chair of COP26, will be the chair of the G20 that year. Again, you might see some coordination around climate. So there are sort of moments for international cooperation that might help. But in terms of what what we can hope for and expect from China, I mean, its previous NDC, its pledge to Paris, wasn't enormously ambitious. So they have got room to increase and to ratchet up that ambition quite significantly. The current peak is, or the peak year they've set is for 2030. They can easily come in much earlier. So we want to see, for example, when the NDC does come in, presumably after the US elections, a peak of some in the 2020s. We'd maybe want to see a net zero target, other kind of ambition multiplying kind of moments in there for it to be taken seriously. But it is a genuinely a kind of a dangerous moment at which lots of things are up for grabs, including with EU-China cooperation real ambition, because I mean what Europe is doing is actually mainstreaming the Green Deal into its recovery package. So the money that's being dispersed through Europe from the European Commission to rebuild sort of Europe post COVID-19 has green industry and digital and the kind of rollout of a low carbon economic development model completely sort of baked into it. So there is an example there for something that could be genuine coordination with China. And I do think that China might take that quite seriously, given their own interest also in having a sort of a leading position in the technologies that are needed for a carbon constrained world.
And maybe just before we turn to Joanna, Joanna, you alluded to this earlier as well, just in your answer on China's climate ambitions. What do you make of the new setup at the Ministry of Environment and Ecology that's split between Huang and Sun, and how that might change China's ambitions?
It's going to be an interesting and sort of critical part of the puzzle. I mean, climate change was moved from the NDRC, the top economic planner, to this new sort of environment super ministry. It's a strange move in a way, because keeping climate and energy together might have made more sense. This now splits energy in the top economic planner and moves climate with traditional kind of regulators of pollution control, and regulators that have a history of being quite constrained in their operations, particularly locally. I think that the new heads of that ministry have a very good reputation. They are thought of as being kind of quite progressive and quite keen to work cooperatively with international counterparts and so on. But beyond that, you're right that it's a very interesting question, but also something of an opaque one to really work through.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, I agree with what was said, and I think that this, the ministerial restructuring is extremely important in terms of coming at this time, right, when not only, was there the shift from NDRC to MEE, which decoupled energy and climate policy, but as was mentioned, sort of new transitions within MEE. So a lot of just real questions about, who are the champions for climate sort of within the energy space now in China. I mean, when we had Vice Minister Xie Jinhua at NDRC, as well as, playing the role of lead climate negotiator, you just had this sort of clear link. You had advocates within that very powerful agency, right, that makes decisions about everything from approving new coal plants to energy pricing decisions. It's less clear now who these champions are for climate change and for low carbon energy technologies. And I think you see casualties of this move, and I fear that the ETS could be a casualty, for example, of this move, where in some ways it made sense to move the oversight of emissions trading to the ministry that had experience with emissions trading for other types of criteria pollutants. But of course, launching the largest global national carbon emissions trading system is a highly political issue, much more than regulating a specific air pollutant, and something that I fear again has sort of lost a champion and an advocate within its new home. I think I agree that there's been a real shift in the language around China's NDC, where before COVID-19 the discussion wasn't whether China would release a new NDC or when. It was just what was going to be in it, how stringent was it going to be. I think a lot of interesting discussion about whether a peak year would be moved up, whether we would see non-CO2 gases included, for example, as a way of increasing ambition, in addition to increasing non-fossil energy targets and other intensity targets. But now I think, again, with so much uncertainty surrounding, again, not just the postponement of COP26, and the real uncertainty surrounding the U.S. election, and of course that absolutely playing a pivotal role here in shaping U.S. engagement on this issue. I think there's going to be far less attention to this issue in China and around the world than we were anticipating just a few months ago. And so briefly, you asked about the U.S.-China piece as well. I mean, I think climate change just has to be a crucial element of U.S.-China engagement going forward. To do anything constructive about climate change globally. Of course, this was previously seen as a more positive area in an overall cooperative relationship, but the nature of this relationship has really changed quite dramatically in recent years. And so I do think it's important to understand that this means that if, for example, we were to see a Biden presidency, we won't be able to just go back to the prior model of climate and energy cooperation and reinstate all the bilateral agreements we had, for example, during the Obama era. But there are real benefits to both China and the US better coordinating on climate change. And when the US worked with China, we were able to leverage our joint responsibility and role in this problem to forge not only a new global climate agreement in Paris, but also several crucial wins to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, for example, from HFCs, from aviation emissions. And I think without more coordination, we risk valuable global action, not being taken during this next decade, which, by all counts, if you look at the science, this is the decisive decade for dealing with climate change. So we can't wait another 4 years or another 8 years, depending on the outcome of the US election, to reduce global emissions. And this is going to require constructive engagement with China to make sure they do their part, to make sure everyone does their part.
I mean, I feel like I keep being the pessimist here. I mean, obviously we all understand the need for constructive engagement. The trajectory of US-China doesn't seem to be very constructive right now. That might change, and that will hopefully change. But I guess the other side of that argument, or the element that has come up quite a bit in China over the past couple of years in relation to US-China tensions, has been the energy security dimension. And that has been flagged by Sam as well as sort of the rise of coal. But I'd like to turn to you here, Erica, on energy security and how it's been viewed in the oil and gas industry and how that's changed some of the thinking, again, either for coal or just for oil and gas.
Yeah, sure. I'll take that and answer with respect to oil and gas. And I see the US-China bilateral relationship and the deterioration, I think, in recent years, and especially over the past year or two, is having sort of at least two impacts on China's oil and gas industry. I think the first one is to heighten concerns about oil and gas supply security, especially if you take trade war tensions and you combine them with US sanctions on Iran and Venezuela, two suppliers of oil to China. And you also throw in, the attacks on Saudi oil infrastructure. I think that raise concerns about supply security and really underscored the importance of having diversified import portfolios in China. And then the second issue I wanted to flag is how US policies towards Huawei and ZTE actually have trickled down into the oil and gas space in China. That again, like over the past year, I've seen leaders on oil and gas issues in the Chinese government and China's oil industry express concerns that the United States might pull a Huawei or pull a ZTE on them and basically cut off the supply of key pieces of equipment that China imports for the development of unconventional resources and deep water resources. And even though I haven't seen any indications that that was something that the US government was planning, I think it is noteworthy that that was something that people were at least thinking about. And that of course prompted calls to, indigenize in production in these areas.
Thanks, Erica. Now, I could keep on asking you guys questions for at least another hour, but we are coming up to the end of our allocated time. There were questions that we didn't get to. I mean, I'm sure that everyone on the panel will be happy to follow up with people individually. But for now, I would really like to thank our panelists for what has been an extremely comprehensive and insightful discussion. And I would like to thank you, our audience, for joining us today. It has been a fantastic pleasure to be on this US-China series.